when it comes to writing essays and teaching students to write essays, how is the best way for us to go about that? So firstly, I'd like to discuss kind of first experiences with essays. So when do we introduce them in year 12? How do we introduce them? Do we build them up, or do we just give it throw them in at the deep end and see how they get on? And then I'd like to talk about what makes a good economics essay, and maybe compare that to exam questions, and are they the same thing, and what maybe similarities do they have, and which should we be preparing them for? And then any strategies that we've got to help essay writing, and how we manage those. And then just a practical thing, how we set essay writing. Is it primarily a homework activity or a lesson activity, or both, and kind of our routines around essay writing. So first of all, when do you get students to start writing essays? Do you wait till that they've shown competency in analysis and evaluation and can put everything together? Or do you teach those skills as you go and kind of just improving them bit by bit? Or do you build up, maybe with starting with shorter answers, particularly if you tend to work with exam style questions? Do you I don't know, maybe perfect the 10-mark question and then the 15-mark question and then a 20-mark question and build up from there? I know that some teachers start with writing essays that aren't economics based, just to get them writing an argument and to kind of get an idea of their writing skills. And how often do we get students to write essays? So I'm really thinking about year 12 or lower sixth. How do we introduce students to essay writing? Does anyone have any answers to any of those questions? Anything they tend to do? Lisa?
Hi. I tend to, I'm realising as I'm sitting here, very much follow the style of questions in the Edexcel spec, what they'd be expected to do. And the first half term, I might do a 5-mark question and then build up each half term till, around Easter time, looking at a full 25 marker, because then they've got the skills. It's just a little bit longer by then. So yeah, it's very, very much led by the type of question that they would be expected to answer. So I wouldn't say that I do any essays particularly for the love of the subject or learning or writing. It is very much led by the exam. It's a bit sad, really.
There are some benefits to that, because the way that Edexcel tends to structure the exams is that it starts off with mainly knowledge, then a bit of application, and then it adds in bits as you go along. So in some respects, it's a sensible approach, because you're building students up as they go, and it's perhaps not too daunting to start with an essay. So I think there's certainly an argument for it. Caroline, she tries to look at an essay a week, readout or jigsaw. So reading out an essay that someone has written, or like a model essay that someone's written, and they're looking at the structure and the content and discussing that. After tax, you start writing an essay about fat tax or sugar tax. Then mid-December, they have the kind of you give them full essays after that. So again, it seems like you're introducing them to the essays, but they're not perhaps writing the full ones until later. Is that right? Cool. That's another way. It's another way of building that up. And any other approaches? Does anyone throw them in at the deep end and kind of get them to do some writing straight off?
Ish, yeah, but not. I think this is possibly because I mentioned it last time that I do some just sort of some questions, economic questions, but no regard to mark scheme or numbers or anything like that, and just say write some stuff on this, and then through that doing quite a lot of modelling, quite a lot of example work on the board and visualizer and stuff, and trying to sort of pick apart some writing. And then only quite a long way down the line to actually really start caring about the exam requirements exactly.
And if you're setting kind of big writing questions, well, not big writing.
Well, they're not that big necessarily. They're possibly quite small, and it depends how they interpret the question, really.
Are those possibly like argument type questions, or are they quite?
No, quite a few of them that I do early on are quite just, well, we'd call them eventually like analytical, just descriptive ones rather than necessarily, argument ones.
I just on that, I'd be really interesting if anyone does write ones early on, because on what topic you write on, because certainly in the Edexcel course there's quite a bulk to start with. Maybe there's a bit of specialisation, but until they get quite a long way in, they can't really show an opinion about anything, because it's just telling them stuff. Sarah?
We start quite early on by using kind of news articles. So getting them to write an argument about whether they agree or disagree with the news article that they've got in front of them. So it could be that they choose a news article or don't choose a news article, but it's all about kind of then formulating an argument and whether they agree or disagree with the case that they've got in front of you, because we've got the AQA spec, and so it's all based around a case study. But then also the section B is all about their own knowledge. So if we can start getting them to think about what's going on in the wider world from the beginning, they're not only building up arguments, but then when we hit them with the 25 marker, they're kind of going, oh, actually, I'm just doing two sides based on what I've done previously. But there's no kind of mark attached to any of it. It's just about kind of discussion and thinking about it and almost building up like a little scrapbook of what's going on in the wider world.
And do you feedback on those?
Yeah, we do. We talk about them. So we start by doing them in the lesson. So we have 5 lessons a week. So one of our lessons each week would be either a macro or micro lesson based around a news article, or so we just hand out loads of different newspapers and get them to look through and find something that might be that they've studied or that they think might be to do with economics, and then they have to kind of argue for and against it within their kind of pairs or their groups.
And if the topic's related to economics, is there kind of argument an economic argument, or is it?
So we try from the beginning, we do try to get them to think about using a certain number of key terminologies. So we have kind of different criteria. So can you use 3 different uses of an economic key term? Can you relate this to maybe drawing a diagram? Can you start thinking about applying it to something else that's happened in another country? And actually going right back to basics of, can you tell me whether it's a micro or macro concept? And that's really helpful because it allows us differentiation as well then.
So that seems like you're bringing in some elements from the kind of mark scheme without even really kind of making it official.
Yeah.
So Gavin, you do one on planned versus free market. That is a big topic. I bet that you get all sorts of answers on that, but you don't mark it. You don't give them any marks for ages as they get preoccupied on the mark. And that's very, very common. Isn't there that research that once they see the mark, they don't see anything else? You don't do many essays until right at the end of year 13. That's particularly interesting that you leave it right until the end. And if you're leaving that till the end, is that when you say you don't do many essays until right at the end of year 13? Is that kind of formal essays or writing in general, or kind of do they do discussion up to that point? Blitz it at the end. Blitz formal essays. Am I interpreting that right? Cool. That's interesting. And then who else was? Oh, Adam. So Adam has a similar approach to Lisa by the sounds of it, building up as you go, starting with the 2 and 4, then the 9 and 15, then the 25 mark, and then look at several exemplar 25 markers first at different grades. That's interesting. And then spend a lesson or 2 and pick it up before you write essays. Okay, so it seems like we've got quite a broad range of of strategies here. I think, it seems like there's lots of different approaches. I tend to start with writing a non-economic essay just to see what their arguments are like and whether they can form an argument and look at style a bit more. But I'm aware that style isn't actually particularly important for the exam, which we'll get onto in a minute. Caroline, so you do a non-economic example too. However, I'm always worried that would then feed into man on the bus answers, not in that maybe that fosters later on that they think, oh, I know how to write a good argument, and then write a great essay, but it's got no economics in it. So I think perhaps that's something that I need to be a bit careful on. I think that probably leads us into the next question, is to what makes a good economics essay? Where can we go for a good example of an economics essay? And is that the same as a good exam answer? And we've already sort of started discussing when we introduce exam criteria and that sort of thing. But it'd be interesting to see what we think a good what we think a good economics essay is, and where we can look for some examples of that. And also vice versa. Do good economics essays make good exam answers? And then also just it'd be interesting to see how people deal with timed elements. Does anyone have any answers to any of those questions?
I think, Isabella, it's very interesting that you say about are they mutually exclusive in the sense of writing good essays and writing things that will get good marks in exams. And I think there's an opportunity. We use at the start of the course, we have a Thinking Like an Economist course that runs alongside initial content. So our initial first big piece of writing is using an Economist article on maybe one of the briefing articles. So it's lengthy, and it's essentially at that stage just a comprehension to see if they've picked up some of the ideas within it. And we ask no mark based to the question, but a typically evaluative question where you need to present a balanced argument, and then you need to reach a judgment that responds to the question. And from there, that leads into discussion of how knowledge is presented in economics, and essentially what the assessment objectives are of what do we mean by knowledge, what do we mean by applying it. When we talk about analysis, what is that in economics? And when we talk about evaluation and critical thought, what does that mean? So it starts to formalize their understanding of what the assessment objectives are, but it also essentially is looking at how do you communicate as an economist. Sorry.
No, I was just going to comment, but carry on.
Well, I think the articles from The Economist magazine are brilliant for that, because you can almost go through with 4 different coloured highlighters, going, there's AO1, there's AO2, there's AO3, there's AO4, and the kids don't have to put names to it, but they can just see how economic knowledge is communicated. And then you can jump off from there into I think that the great example of like starting with some basic KAA type questions, building it up, and then some kind of not essays, but ones where you've got to add critical thought into them, and then go for the full essay.
One minor. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, so that kind of suggests that the articles in The Economist are a good example of an economics essay, and I think I would probably agree with that they are a good example of an economics essay. But the only thing I would wonder whether the style is in the academic sense. So, for example, a good economics essay academically, whether the Economist articles would meet those thresholds, because they certainly meet the thresholds of an A-level essay. And as you said, it seems that actually, in that sense, what makes a good what makes a good Economist article and what makes a good essay seem to be really well intertwined. So that's really encouraging, and actually it's something that students view a lot as well.
I think I wouldn't hold it up as a model answer of an essay. I think the use of them is how do you communicate as an economist, which is, there's a slight nuance there in that they're a useful resource to help students understand how knowledge is presented, and thus as a lead-in to building up understanding of what the assessment objectives are at A-level. But yeah, no, they're not written as an essay, and they're not. You're not going to put that in front of students as an exemplar of an essay.
But it might be a more important skill for them to learn, actually. Andrew.
Well, I was just going to say a relatively minor aside, but exactly what. Sorry, I don't actually your name, Jay Andrews.
John, I think.
What specific thing I mentioned with the Economist articles is I quite like the sort of light touch way they bring in bits of knowledge to try and avoid students doing that sort of like start an essay with a load of definitions. It's like, whereas the Economist will sort of treat the reader as an intelligent and knowledgeable person, but define some terms. So it will say like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said yesterday or whatever, and putting that sort of little bits of knowledge in a subclause or in a bracket or in a hyphen, I think it's quite a nice way to sort of try and get the students to write a bit better and more sort of fluently and lighter touch than they sometimes instinctively do.
And just kind of almost building on that, we've kind of talked about a bit how how communicating economics well, as in The Economist, does often meet the objectives that we need, but kind of almost moving beyond objectives. Almost, there's a bit of a chat going on about Daisy Christodoulou and comparative judgment. Andrew, have you done?
Well, I've got a lot of thoughts about this topic in general, but they're possibly slightly parallel with what the questions are asking. So I won't go off on a complete tangent here, but I don't know. I think some of this. I think some of this really depends upon what we even mean by essays, and I have never found anything I'm such a zealot about in teaching than I hate Edexcel. I think their questions are abysmal, and because of some of the things we are talking about, that the Edexcel questions are. Well, I think a lot of them are badly written generally, but they're formulaic, and they do involve those assessment objectives in a really sort of, I don't know, teachable way. So I know what you're about to go on to about sort of writing frames and so on. Well, yeah, I think the Edexcel questions do that. But it also makes them, I think, sort of superficial and gives them like the air of application and evaluation, but they haven't really said very much often. And they're also much shorter. The final, the 25-mark essays are 30 minutes versus about 40 minutes in AQA. So what can you say in an essay, and what are the sort of what's the substance of it? I think are actually very different questions between those two main exam boards. So I was talking about comparative judgment. I think the AQA one, with its full-on levels, having marked for AQA quite a bit, you can just sort of look at it and say, is this a good essay to a great extent, and give it a mark according to your sort of professional but yes subjective judgment. And the Edexcel ones still want you to sort of jump through some, I think, fairly artificial hoops about what is like the right answer. And so I think there's a big difference between those two styles. So you said about like the man on the omnibus thing. Well, to some extent, I quite like that in not exactly the answers, but the questions. I think some of the Edexcel questions contain a lot of sort of implicit instructions about how you've got to formulate it. And the AQA questions are pretty much uniformly intelligible to someone who hasn't done a lot of economics. And they might not know the economics to answer it fully, but they understand what the question means. Well, I think there are some Edexcel questions where I'm looking at it going, I don't actually really know what that's asking me to do. So I've got a proto blog post because I've mentioned I'm changing jobs. They were on Edexcel, and I've written a thing about why I want to move.
It's a lot of words by the sounds of it, isn't it? Isn't it like 3,000 words? 6,500
words on why I think this. So I'll probably post that at some point. But I'm not going to read them all out. I'm not going to read them all out now. But it's related to what we're talking about here, about how you actually the form of assessment determines the style of approach, determines the teaching that you have to do it, and I think there's a big difference between.
It'd be interesting to see whether it's possible to have that kind of big picture approach in Edexcel. The one thing I would say about Edexcel is that I think it does expect, this is going off on a tangent a bit, but I do think it does expect them to write a 45-minute essay in 30 minutes, just the quantity of what they want you to write, maybe not the depth, but the quantity seems.
Yeah, and the number of arguments. Yeah. I also think there's an issue here of there is no one essay. It depends upon the question, and so I glibly, and my students get really annoyed by this, but they ask me exactly this question: how do I write this essay? And I say, well, answer the question. And if the essay is able to be interpreted like that, then great, you're away. But if it's not, then it's really hard.
And it adds an extra skill in as well, interpreting what the question is asking of them and what they.
Well, and that's a meta cognitive knowledge thing about, are you a sort of experienced economist to know what this is getting at and know what it's talking about really implicitly behind what's in the actual words of the question.
Just picking up on Gavin's point, I think, are you thinking about perhaps when you're asking if Andrew's already written on this? I think that it kind of feeds into the trends element of looking at economic trends and rather than kind of new events.
Yeah, it's all related. But no, I've got a big one coming, Gavin.
Interesting comment from Sarah. So does this therefore not mean that Edexcel will make them better for them to do well, but doesn't necessarily make them economists?
That's part of what I've written. Yes.
I think I'm wondering whether it's possible to do both, but whether one makes it easier or not does make a big difference to kind of how we think about that. Just quickly on the comparative judgment element, because lots of schools and departments, particularly bigger departments at GCSE, are moving towards comparative judgment as looking at comparing essays one against the other and which one is better, and therefore you don't have to rely quite so heavily on criteria as to what makes a good essay, because a lot of that is intangible. My query, and I don't know if anyone has the answer to this, is the fact that economics classes and cohorts tend to be smaller. I mean, I know there are bigger colleges that have kind of 4 or 5 groups, but whether there's any kind of system for working that with small groups.
The size of the cohort doesn't necessarily make too much difference, but the number of judges and the number of teachers is a really useful addition to that. So if you are on your own, comparative judgment, you might as well not bother doing a formal system and just sort of look at them and try and take the spirit. But if you've got a department of 5, you could easily set up a system where you're all judging each other's and get some really exciting stuff going.
Yeah, and kind of almost building on that, Adam's saying that you tend to find essays tend to be more formulaic. But the essay writing competitions tend to be less formulaic, and actually those might be good examples of economics essays as well. Looking at the winning examples, even in some ways you're then looking at examples of things that are examples. But I agree that does open their eyes a little bit, and that makes them better economists. And then comparing the IB mark schemes versus the UK mark schemes, again, less prescriptive and perhaps give us more scope. Moving on then to kind of how we teach good essays within the confines of the criteria that we've got, and trying to do well by students in terms of making them good economists, good economic communicators, as John said, which is I hadn't really thought about that as a separate thing, but actually it probably is maybe a more important skill, and also to get them decent marks. So strategies that we use, anybody? Okay, well, I'll just go for a little bit, because I was reading the history community, the history education community is generally really good and puts all the other subjects to shame. But they've written quite a lot and about scaffolding. And actually how sometimes writing frames and using cards and things like that can be really helpful and can stop students from thinking that there's a blank page, and can help students understand what structure is, but it can also hinder their thinking, and how we balance those two kind of elements. Does anyone have any? Sarah, is your pen not? Is that? she's just flailing around. So in my experience, I found that using cards and kind of write down your 5 key points and then rearranging them to make some kind of semblance of a structure and a style, and weaving a thread out of it tends to be quite a successful thing, but it takes so long. And also it's quite dependent on whether you give them the points to start with, in which case of how much are they thinking of themselves, and if you don't give them the points to start with, if they've written poor things down on their cards, and they can't weave the thread out of it. So sometimes it has great results, but sometimes it really it doesn't. Does anyone? Andrew?
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but there's I talk a lot about. First of all, I find that they've got lots of like mnemonics and stuff from other subjects and GCSEs that they sort of think they know what a good paragraph looks like and so on. So I tend to ignore that sort of thing and talk to them a lot more about like the architecture, like you're talking about there. Where are you actually going? And this again requires like the knowledge, and it's quite a later thing, like doing the essays a lot in year 13. But the only little techniques I sometimes deploy in class is sometimes I'll give them an essay without its conclusion and ask them to write the conclusion, i.e. you should have some idea where this was going. And if you can't tell where it was going, then the writer hasn't done well enough at conveying the sort of sense of the argument. And then vice versa, I say, and of course this is totally sort of, do they understand their economics? Here's a question, what's your final conclusion? Don't worry about the first bit, write me the last bit. Where would you? And if they can do that, it's more an issue of like, do they have the knowledge? Do they have the understanding? But yeah, those are the two little sort of fun little games I play in the class sometimes.
That can be a good way of getting rid of. Often students struggle with putting something down on paper. They feel that there being an essay is a big deal and it's something they've got to deal with, and it can be quite stressful. But sometimes just writing down the answer and then building on it and building on it and building on it, that can then help. Gavin, competitive paragraphs. So giving 3 key arguments. So you give out 3 key arguments for an essay. 2 students are given one of these arguments. Right, okay, yeah. And then you put them both up in class and you compare which argument you like best and why. So just focusing on, is that each student focuses on one argument at a time? I think that's right. And then Caroline, using the Diamond 9, that can help to kind of prioritize what argument you think is strongest, and to get that discussion going. Do you do that? Do they do that by themselves, or do they do that in groups? In groups, so that at least they're kind of discussing. And I think there's a good quote that says something like that discussing, that talking is the intermediate step between thinking and writing, and sometimes that can help with that. Interesting. And then writing frames. So I used to use writing frames all the time, but I don't think I get the success with them, because I feel like I kind of harness kids into a structure, and then they feel that they have to fit everything into that structure. So does anyone have any ways that they've used writing frames successfully to overcome that problem? Sarah?
We sort of use a bit of a writing frame, but don't hold students to using it by throwing things around the room. So we get them to write, we start with a paragraph, we talk about an essay that we might want to put in, what we're going to do it, they would do in it, and all the content, we discuss it all so that everyone's got a full understanding. And then we talk about kind of the idea of connective phrases to build up the paragraphs and the use of diagrams and things like that. And then they write a sentence and have to throw it to somebody else in the room, so they have to scrumple it up. And then they have to uncrumple it, read that sentence and add to it. And so we talk about the different elements and say, right, okay, this is your point. You need to explain that point. Then you need to put a diagram. Then you need to explain the diagram. And so what it starts to build up is no one knows who has written what. But it also means that people are starting to pick up misconceptions from other people in the class without there being any kind of thought processes of, oh, I don't want to put my hand up and say I don't understand what I'm doing here, but if I write something down that I think might be right and then throw it to somebody else, they don't know I've done it, because we make everyone throw it at the same time, and then it's gone, oh, actually this is wrong, why is this wrong? And it helps us discuss it and build on it by also using kind of a very basic model. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, particularly for the point of just, once they've written something, they can write something else. Generally, once you've got something down, it is possible to build on that. And almost that's going back to the argument that Andrew said about write your final answer and then kind of, I guess, work backwards from there. And once you've got one sentence, you can build an essay from that. For example, why might a firm merge? So one argument, one pair would have economies of scale, one would have monopsony, and one would have controlling the market. And then the students, do they write opposing articles, the pairs? Do they write kind of one writes one side and one side's the other? And then you'd end up with 6 paragraphs. And interestingly, you do it timed as well. How do other people introduce timings and doing stuff under exam times?
Do stuff under exam times. here's a question. Here's half an hour. Do it. Yeah.
And how early do you introduce that? I know I've got a psychology colleague that does it right from the very first homework. Every week they write a timed essay.
I tend not towards the end, only towards the end really.
And do you find that then they have to start cutting things down? Or do you find that they've got better so they're quicker at it?
I don't know. I think possibly through all the modelling and the previous practice, we sort of roughly know the shape of an answer anyway, so it sort of fits possibly, but not sure.
Any other views on when you introduce timings of essays? Oh, Adam, sorry.
We do timed essays every week from October half term onwards. So from October till Christmas, they can use an A5 cheat sheet if they want to, and we give them the actual essay title. Then from Christmas till February, they know the topic, but not the actual title. So I might say, you're going to do something on inflation or balance of payments. And again, if they want to use a cheat sheet, they can, but they obviously don't know what the actual title is. And then from February half term till the end of study leave, they do a weekly essay and they've got no idea what the essay will be on.
So kind of almost building up the kind of the scariness of it as well.
Yeah.
All the timing. So Gavin does all the timing at the end. Sorry, just going back to so each person ends up with one analytical paragraph with evaluation, and then you can compare them. You can compare the strengths of arguments, and that seems like a really good idea as well. To be able to compare the strengths of arguments. Okay, I'm going to move on.